Why don't we begin with Mark Bookman of the Atlantic Center for Capital Representation. Talk about Terry Williams' case.
Well, you know, the most interesting thing about the case, the death penalty is, you know, supposed to be reserved for the worst of the worst. I mean, that's how all statutes are designed. That's what our Supreme Court has talked about. You know, you take a look at this case and you see a young man, barely 18, who has been sexually abused almost his entire life at the time he commits this crime, this unfortunate crime. And who would say that he's the worst of the worst? I mean, how would anyone decide of all of the people that have committed murders in Pennsylvania that this barely 18-year-old who's been sexually traumatized his entire life would be the worst of the worst? And yet he's the first person that we're going to execute non-voluntarily in 50 years.
Talk about how it is that in his original case, in the original trial, that it was not presented that he was repeatedly raped as he was growing up.
Well, frankly, practically nothing was presented in his original case, and that was not unusual. The trial took place in the mid-'80s in Philadelphia. Virtually nothing was presented, and in fact, the jury found no mitigating circumstances. Now, again, this is an 18-year-old, 18 years and 3 months old, who's been sexually abused his entire life, and this case itself is about that sort of sexual abuse, and yet none of it was presented to the jury, and the jury found literally no mitigating circumstances, no reasons at all to spare him from a death sentence. Just, you know, another example of you know, pretty inept lawyering, I would say.
Who was his lawyer? What happened to his lawyer?
Well, you know, I think that the standard of practice in Philadelphia in the mid-'80s was quite low, and you know,
wasn't his lawyer disbarred?
I don't know about that. That may be the case. I just don't know. But I know that this sort of sexual trauma requires a certain expertise to be elicited. I know Mr. Cervone can certainly talk about that. You know, it's not. You know, if you meet your lawyer a few times and you're facing this kind of a trial, you're not likely to blurt out everything that's happened to you, all of the awful things that have happened to you in your lifetime. It requires a team of lawyers and experts to work slowly and carefully with a traumatized person to elicit this sort of information. And certainly it was not elicited in front of this jury.
I want to read a comment from Assistant District Attorney Ronald Eisenberg about efforts to compare Terry Williams to victims of convicted retired Penn State assistant football coach Jerry Sandusky and predator priests. He said, quote, "That effort to piggyback on these sorry events is, I think, quite cynical. The situation is nothing like the altar boys and other victims of sexual abuse here and in State College." Frank Cervone, your response.
Well, in fact, they're very similar. This is a man who, for which there's lots of corroborating evidence, was sexually abused when he was 6. He was repeatedly abused by different men as a boy. The man he is convicted of killing, for which he got the death penalty, Mr. Norwood, was 56 years old when he was 18 years old. I think one of the significant comparisons and similarities between the Sandusky victims and this fellow lies in their respective similar decisions in their lives not to disclose. It took years for these men to come forward to talk about what happened to them. And that's really understandable. We're getting to see the Sandusky case, the Priest case, cases, and lots of others kind of in the current scene are opening people's eyes to understand why victims would elect not to disclose. Terry Williams he knew he was facing the death penalty, and yet, even in the face of that kind of consequence, he could not bring himself to tell the police, to tell his lawyer, to tell anyone about this history. I have to imagine, and well, he certainly told his lawyers and the court since then, that he was deeply shamed, certainly confused about his sexuality. He kept all that inside. And you have to ask, what happened to you? What caused you to come to be silent?